The moon was already rising when they came for her. Not a gentle knock, not a warning, a breaking. The wooden door splintered inward, and with it, Helen's life, shattered in the space between one breath and the next. She had been sitting by the hearth, stirring cold soup she didn't intend to eat, staring at shadows that had been too long in one place. She had felt something wrong for days. The birds had gone quiet. Her neighbor's dog had stopped barking. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. She barely had time to stand before hands seized her. Rough, practiced, merciless. Rope bit into her wrists, the knot cinched with the efficiency of men who had done this before. A cloth silenced her protests before they could become words, before they could become screams. Outside, the night was wrong. Too still, too expectant. Arrow the kind of silence that waits for something terrible to happen. She was dragged past the threshold of her small home, past the cracked clay pot she had always meant to replace, past the faded embroidery her mother had hung on the wall before she died, past everything ordinary and safe in hers, and thrown into a wagon that smelled of pine resin and old fear. The wheels lurched forward, the village disappeared behind her, and above it all, the full moon, watching. Before we begin, if you love dark Lycan kings, forbidden mates, and stories that make your heart ache, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for epic Lycan king romances, where omegas rise, kings fall, and love is never gentle. The offering. The wagon smelled like fear. Not sweat alone, though there was plenty of that, but the specific, sour tang of people who had stopped believing things would be all right. It was a smell Helen had encountered once before, in the weeks after her mother died, when she had sat alone in that small house and felt the world contract around her like a fist. She wasn't alone. 6 other girls sat bound beside her, arranged along the wooden benches like parcels waiting to be delivered. Each was silent. Each was trembling in her own particular way. One rocked slowly, her eyes glazed and distant. Another stared at the floor with the blank expression of someone who had already begun the process of leaving herself. A third, the youngest, no more than 16, was crying so silently that Helen only knew it by the way the girl's shoulders shook. Helen looked at her hands. The rope was rough. Already the skin at her wrist was raw. She was thinking about whether she could undo the knot with her teeth when someone spoke. "You're new." Helen turned. The voice belonged to a girl sitting across from her, sharp-eyed, straight-backed, with dark curls pulled tight and a posture that belonged in a council chamber, not a prisoner's wagon. She looked perhaps 18. She looked like she had been raised to face things without flinching. "Donna," the girl said. "Remember that name? You might hear it again if I'm chosen." Chosen. The word made Helen's stomach turn over like cold earth. "What is this?" Helen managed, her voice rough from the cloth they'd used to gag her. "Where are they taking us?" Donna tilted her head. The torchlight outside the wagon slats moved across her face, and for a moment she looked older than 18, ancient even in the way of someone who knows something they wish they didn't. "We're offerings," she said simply. The wagon hit a rut. Someone whimpered. "To him." Helen didn't ask who him was. She already knew. Everyone in every village within 40 miles knew. That was the horror of it. The devil they made. They called him many things. Monster, beast, curse, abomination, the unmade, the end of pacts, the one who would not kneel. But the name that lingered longest, the name that crossed the lips of village elders and terrified children and hardened warriors alike, was the simplest one. Devil, Alpha Justin, the last Lycan. Not just a wolf, but something older. Something that had existed before the packs had rules, before alphas had councils, before anyone had decided that power needed to be managed and contained and diluted into something safe. He was what wolves had been at the beginning, raw, untethered, answerable to no one. The kind of creature that made other predators remember they were prey. The stories were consistent in their horror, if not their details. Warriors sent to subdue him returned broken, or didn't return at all. 3 packs had united against him once, 72 fighters converging on the eastern woods at dawn. 12 came back. They didn't speak of what happened. They didn't need to. Entire bloodlines had bent the knee simply to stay off his path. And yet, he hadn't killed every girl they sent him. He had rejected them, one by one. Every full moon, when the ritual demanded a luna, a mate chosen to ground a Lycan's power, to anchor the beast before it devoured everything including itself, they sent him women. And every full moon, he turned them away. Some came back unconscious. Some came back weeping and couldn't explain why. Some came back changed in ways that were subtle and then, later, weren't. None came back chosen, and yet the packs kept sending more. Because a rumor had survived every rejection. A whisper passed between healers and scholars and the oldest of the old, who still remembered the ancient texts. A true virgin could tame him. Not just a woman of purity, but one whose power was unawakened, unbonded, untouched by the will of any other wolf. A vessel that had never been claimed, never been shaped, never been altered by another's energy. If such a woman stood before the last Lycan under the full moon, if the bond formed, he could be controlled. And if he could be controlled, he could be aimed. And if he could be aimed, he could be used. That was why they kept sending girls. Not to save them, not to honor them, not even to satisfy some ancient ritual that couldn't be stopped. To find a leash. The lair. The devil's lair was not what Helen expected. She had imagined fire. She had imagined the stench of sulfur and rotting things. She had imagined bones, perhaps a throne made of them. It was worse. Stone, cold, ancient. The kind of ancient that predated memory, that predated the oldest stories the packs told about themselves. The cavern opened beneath a hillside that the wagon had been circling for almost an hour, and when they pulled the girls out and marched them toward the entrance, Helen felt the shift in the air immediately. Something was different here. Something had been here for a very long time. Torches flickered along the cavern walls, their light orange and unsteady, casting shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. The ceiling was too high to see. The floor was worn smooth, not by water, but by footsteps, decades of them, centuries perhaps. The air was not stale. That was the strangest thing. It should have been. Underground, sealed away, the domain of something that didn't emerge into daylight. It should have smelled of damp and rot in ancient earth. Instead, it smelled of pine, cold stone, rain on granite. It smelled like a forest at night, like something alive. Helen felt it before she saw anything. A pressure in her chest. Not fear, though fear was certainly there, threading through everything else. But something else, something older than fear, something her wolf recognized before her mind did. A presence, watching, waiting, hungry. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her breathing even. She told herself both of those things were under her control. She was not certain that was true. The first rejection. They took the first girl quickly. Her name was Mara. Helen had learned that in the wagon, when the girl had been reciting it like a prayer, over and over, as though saying it enough times would make the world remember she was a person. Mara, Mara, Mara. Her family had given her to the ritual willingly. That was the thing that had hollowed her eyes. They cut her ropes. They opened the inner door. Or they pushed her through. The door slammed shut behind her. Silence. Terrible silence. The kind that has weight, that presses against the ears, that makes the heart beat louder just to fill it. The remaining girls stood in a rough line along the cavern wall, guards at intervals, torches burning. No one spoke. No one moved. Helen counted her own heartbeats. She got to 47 before it happened. A growl, low, violent. Not the growl of a wolf. She had heard wolf growls, had grown up near enough to wild things to know the difference between a warning and an attack. This was neither. This was something that lived below language, below instinct, below anything with a name. It tore through the stone walls as though stone were nothing. It tore through the chest like something physical. Two of the girls gasped. One pressed herself against the wall. Donna didn't move, but her hands, clasped in front of her, went white at the knuckles. Mara screamed. One scream, high, brief, absolute. And then, nothing. The door opened. Mara came out, or rather, she was carried out, draped over the arms of a guard, with the limpness of someone deeply unconscious. Not injured. The guards who handled her were practiced at this, businesslike, as though it happened often. Because it did happen often. Because this was not the first time. Helen understood that now with a clarity she hadn't had before. This ritual had been happening for months, maybe years. Girls were sent in. Girls came out unconscious, and they kept sending more. The second girl went in. The second girl came out. The third. The fourth. Hope entered. Despair came out. Helen's pulse was not calm. She had given up pretending that it was. Star. 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 Full moon. Donna's truth. Donna moved closer while the fourth girl was being removed. She was careful about it, efficient, unhurried, the way someone moves when they don't want to draw attention. She positioned herself next to Helen with the ease of someone who had been calculating their every action since they arrived. "You're not going to scream," Donna said quietly. It wasn't a question. Helen looked at her. "That depends on what's in there." Donna almost smiled. Almost. "It depends on whether he triggers the fear response or the bond response. I've been told they're—" "How do you know so much about this?" Helen interrupted. The almost smile disappeared. "My family sent me, prepared me. There are—" A pause, carefully weighted. Texts, records of previous rituals. Some girls were conscious afterward. Some of them wrote things down. Chose to come. Helen heard the softening in Donna's voice for what it was. Not kindness. Resignation. "My family needs this. They need the alliance. If I'm chosen, if I can bond with the last Lycan, they rise. They survive." Donna's voice dropped on the last word, and Helen heard it then. The thing underneath the composure. The thing that all the preparation in the world couldn't entirely bury. "There are debts, old ones, the kind that don't forgive." Helen looked at the inner door. The fifth girl had gone in 2 minutes ago. The growl hadn't come yet. "And you think he'll choose you?" "I know what I'm supposed to be." Donna's chin lifted fractionally. "I know what they trained me to offer. Whether that's what he wants is—" She stopped. "I know I'm what they want. The packs, the elders. I'm exactly what they've been trying to send." Her gaze moved to Helen then. Slow, assessing. "You, on the other hand." "I know," Helen said. "Tiger Lily." The name fell between them like a stone into still water. Helen said nothing. The fifth girl screamed. "The mixed coat. Tiger Lily." It was what they called those born between bloodlines, between a standard pack wolf and something older. Something that didn't fit cleanly into any category the current councils had devised. Her father had been a wanderer, a wolf without allegiance. Her mother had been from a border pack, whose ancestry stretched back further than records went. The result was Helen, faster than she should be, sharper senses. A wolf that responded to threats before her conscious mind registered them. Instincts that sometimes bordered on prescience, not true sight, not magic, but the kind of animal intelligence that looks like it from a distance. She had always been different. In a village, different was tolerated, mildly useful, occasionally inconvenient, something neighbors whispered about but mostly forgot in the day-to-day business of living. In a ritual chamber, kneeling before the last Lycan, different might be the reason she didn't walk out. She had heard the theories. The scholars who had studied Lycan biology, what little records remained, suggested that the last Lycan's rejections weren't about purity in the way the packs understood it. They weren't about innocence or virtue or even bloodline purity in the traditional sense. And they were about compatibility. The Lycan bond wasn't a leash, it wasn't a collar, It was a recognition, the deepest kind, wolf to wolf, the kind that bypassed everything learned and reached something fundamental. A tiger lily might be too unpredictable for recognition, or she might be exactly what recognition looked like. Helen had never been able to decide which possibility frightened her more. Meh. The door opens. Donna went before Helen. She walked to the inner door with the measured stride of someone who had practiced it, back straight, chin level, hands loose at her sides. She turned once, briefly, and her expression was absolutely unreadable. The door opened. The door closed. Helen waited. 38 seconds this time. The growl came. Lower this time. Not violent. It was something more complex that Helen couldn't categorize. Something almost like, Donna screamed. The door opened. Donna came out conscious, which was different from the others. She was shaking, visibly, fully, in a way that absolutely destroyed her earlier composure. And she walked past Helen without looking at her, without saying anything, and sat against the far wall, with her knees pressed to her chest and her face turned away. Not chosen, not destroyed, but shaken to whatever foundation she had built herself on. Then, Helen! Her name echoed through the cavern as though the stone itself had spoken it. Not the voice of a guard, something else. Something that had come from beyond the inner door, through the stone, as though walls were not a meaningful obstacle. Her body reacted before her mind could. Cold, heat, fear, something else. And the ropes were cut. The guard's knife scraped her wrist and she barely felt it. Her legs barely held her when she stood, but they held. She straightened. She faced the inner door. It opened, and the darkness beyond it was absolute. They pushed her forward anyway, into the dark. Kamraka the devil. The door closed behind her, and then silence. Not the silence of an empty space. The silence of a space that is very, very full, of one thing, of one presence, of something that had long since stopped needing to announce itself. The torches in this inner chamber were lower than those outside, their light barely reaching the walls. The ceiling was invisible. The floor was the same worn stone. Helen stood very still. She couldn't see him, but she could feel him. Close. Too close. A breath brushed the back of her neck. Helen's body did not freeze in the way of prey. It froze in the way of something that has encountered an equal and doesn't yet know what to make of it. Her wolf rose, not in panic but in attention, in the sharpened focus that preceded decision. You're different. The voice was deep, rough, not quite human, not because it was inhuman in its tone, but because it carried undertones that human voices didn't have, things that bypassed hearing and went somewhere else, somewhere older. Helen swallowed once. I didn't choose this. Silence. Long enough that she almost thought he wouldn't respond. Then, a low sound. Almost amused. Almost. None of you do. She heard him move. Not footsteps precisely. More like a shift in the air. A redistribution of the darkness. He was circling her. She tracked it with her senses instead of her eyes. And because her eyes were useless here, and because tracking with your senses instead of your eyes was something tiger lily wolves did naturally. She thought he might have noticed that. She thought that might be significant. The edge of fear. He moved around her. Slow, predatory, but not the kind that meant imminent violence. The kind that meant study. That meant something was being assessed, cataloged, considered with a patience that most living things didn't have. Helen breathed. In, out, even. Her heartbeat was not even. Her heartbeat was a disaster. But she had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing about fear is what you show of it. And so she kept her hands still, her shoulders level, and let the breathing do the work of calming everything underneath. Well, you're not afraid. I'm extremely afraid, Helen said. But you're not running. Running would be stupid. A beat. Wouldn't it? The movement stopped. He was behind her and slightly to the left. She knew this without looking. You don't smell like the others, he murmured. Helen kept her voice steady. Maybe that's why you'll reject me too. The silence after this was different from the silences before it. It had texture to it. Weight. She felt it pressing against her back like a hand that hadn't touched her yet. "We'll see her," he said, and then he stepped closer. Very close. Close enough that she could feel the heat of him. And he was warm, unnaturally warm. The way a thing that burns from the inside is warm, and something inside her chest responded to that warmth with a recognition that terrified her more than the darkness, more than the silence, more than anything that had happened in the wagon or the outer chamber or any of the long, horrible hours between her door splintering and this moment. Because it wasn't terror, it wasn't revulsion, it was something she had no name for. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Chapter 10. The breaking point. Internal. A shift. Something cracks open. His presence overwhelmed her, not the way that darkness overwhelms light, by absence, by negation, but the way that gravity overwhelms objects that think they are standing still. Irresistible and impersonal and absolutely real. Helen felt her wolf stir, not in fear, in recognition. The sensation was unlike anything she had a framework for. Her wolf, usually so pragmatic, so silent, the part of her that assessed threats and calculated angles, went suddenly quiet in a way that was not suppression, but attention. The way you go quiet when you finally hear the sound you've been waiting for. Helen gasped, not a scream, not fear, just the involuntary sound of something opening that had been closed. "What?" Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "What are you doing to me?" The warmth behind her shifted. His voice dropped, and it was close enough now that she felt the words as much as heard them. "I'm not doing anything." A pause so heavy it had corners. "You are." Helen turned. She couldn't not turn. And in the low light of the inner chamber, for the first time, she saw him. Not a monster. Not the rotting horror of story and nightmare. A man, if man was even the right word, tall and scarred and still in the way of things that don't need to move to be powerful. His eyes caught the torchlight and held it differently than eyes should, and the lines of his face were not softness, but they were not cruelty either. They were something that had been through both of those things and come out the other side. He looked at her the way she looked at him, like he had been waiting, like he didn't know what to make of that either. The shift. The moment stretched between them like something living, tight, fragile, dangerous in the way of things that, once broken, cannot be unbroken. Helen had always trusted the part of herself that didn't think, the part that responded before analysis, that moved before intention. She had been taught to distrust it, to sand it down, to replace it with the careful deliberateness that allowed tiger lily wolves to exist in communities that found them unsettling. She had been told that the instinct was the dangerous part. Standing here in the dark, looking at him, she thought perhaps they had it backwards. He reached out, slowly. No sudden movement, no violence, no claim. Just the extension of a hand toward her jaw, not touching, hovering at the edge of contact, asking a question without language. She didn't pull away. His touch was brief, 2 fingers against her jaw, the lightest possible pressure, and the warmth, that internal burning warmth, moved through the contact like current through water, not aggressive but present, undeniable, electric, not gentle, but not cruel either. Something that existed outside those categories. Something that was simply what it was, without apology, without artifice. Helen's breath left her slowly. Her wolf, which had been balanced on the edge of something, went. Not calm exactly, but settled. The way a compass settles on north after spinning. And then, as quickly as it had begun, he pulled away. The cold that replaced the warmth was extraordinary. Helen hadn't realized how cold she'd been before, until the absence of heat reminded her. Rejection. The force that struck her was not his hands. It was something else. His power, his alpha command, the part of him that existed below the physical. It hit her like a wave, like a wall, like the concussive force of something detonating. Not aimed to kill, not even aimed to wound, aimed to push. Helen hit the ground hard. The breath left her lungs completely, her vision blurred. White, then gray, then a slow, nauseating color creeping back. The stone floor was cold against her palms. She became aware from a distance that she was still conscious, which meant she had done better than most. Not yet, he growled. 2 words. No explanation, no apology, no context that would make them make sense. Not yet, not never, not no, not rejected, not yet. The door opened. Hands, the guard's hands, practiced and impersonal, dragged her out into the light of the outer chamber. She barely heard the whispers, barely felt the cold. Her ears were ringing and her lungs were still negotiating with gravity, and every thought she had was slow and imprecise. But underneath all of it, one thing she knew with absolute certainty: he hadn't rejected her. Not completely. Not yet was a different thing entirely from no. And somewhere in the cavern that she was being pulled away from, she thought perhaps he knew that too. Aftermath. They put her against the wall with the others. The other girls stared. The ones who were conscious stared. The ones who had come around from their unconsciousness stared. Even the guards glanced her way and then glanced away, which was unusual. Guards at a ritual like this were trained not to notice the offerings, trained to process them as cargo, and guards were noticing her. Donna had straightened from her position against the far wall. Her composure had partially reassembled itself. The way a shattered thing can approximate wholeness in the dark. But her eyes were afraid. What happened? Donna demanded. Low, urgent. Helen was still getting her breath back. I don't know. You were in there longer than the rest of us. Helen looked at her. Was I? 3 minutes at least. The others were under a minute. Donna's voice was precise and frightened and trying to be only the first thing. What did he do? Did he touch you? Did he? He said not yet, Helen said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Helen had heard all evening. Donna sat back slowly. Something moved through her expression. Something complicated and layered and not entirely identifiable. Not quite jealousy, not quite relief. Something that lived in the territory between them. Helen looked at the inner door. It was closed. It was always closed now. The ritual was over. The full moon already past its peak. The guards beginning the administrative process of returning unused offerings. But she kept looking at it anyway. Because something inside her, the wolf, the tiger lily blood, the part of her that settled like a compass on north, was still pointed at it, was still oriented toward the thing behind it. And it wasn't over. She knew that, in the way you know the things that matter most, without knowing why they matter, without choosing it, only knowing that they do. The mark. That night, they housed the offerings in a low building at the lair's edge. Stone walls, straw, a single barred window. Standard handling for girls who had been through the ritual, as Helen understood it. Rest, assessment, return. Helen couldn't sleep. Her skin burned. Not painfully, not the sharp sting of injury, but the deep interior burning of something changing. Something being written into her biology in a language she didn't have words for yet. Her senses, already sharper than a normal wolf's, had sharpened further. She could hear the breathing of every girl in the room, could hear the footsteps of the guards outside with a clarity that turned individual footfalls into data. Weight, gait, mood. Could hear at the far edge of her range something else. Movement. Underground. The particular quality of a very large thing moving with very deliberate quietness. Her heartbeat changed when she heard it, involuntarily, before she had decided anything. And then, in the distance, from somewhere beneath the hill, a howl. Not the territorial declaration that wolves use to mark range. Not the rallying call of a pack leader moving their people. Something older than either of those things. Something that didn't have a tactical purpose and didn't need one. a howl that sounded like recognition, like something calling to something it had found, like a question being asked into the dark. Helen sat up in the dark and pressed her palm to her chest, above her heart, above the place where the burning was loudest, and felt it pulse once against her hand like an answer. The truth they hid by morning, the building outside was alive with argument. Helen could hear it before the sun was fully up. Voices overlapping, urgent, the particular cadence of important people discovering that something had happened outside their calculations. She listened through the wall with her newly sharpened senses and assembled the conversation from fragments. The ritual had failed. Or rather, the ritual had not done what it was supposed to do. No Luna had been chosen. No bond had formed. Not visibly, not in the way they had planned. And yet the reports from the chamber guards said that the last Lycan had not rejected all the offerings. One had been in the room for 3 minutes. One had come out conscious. One had been told, not yet. The elder who seemed to be leading the argument, an old woman whose voice carried the dry authority of someone whose opinions had been mistaken for laws for many decades, was insisting that the offering in question had to be sent back immediately, before the moon phase shifted, and before whatever had begun in the chamber had time to develop into something the ritual council couldn't manage. A younger voice argued back, cautious, tentative, losing. The old woman won, as old women with that kind of voice always win. Helen already knew what they had decided before the guard came to unlock the door. She had been dressing for the last hour, because the ritual had not failed. She understood that now, with a certainty, she couldn't entirely explain and didn't need to. Something had been set in motion in that inner chamber. Something that the ritual council had been trying to create for years, with every offering they sent and every moon they spent in frustrated failure. It had happened, just not the way they planned, and not with the girl they wanted. It had happened with her, Tiger Lily, in the one no one had calculated for. Star, 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 new moon, return to the lair. They brought her back. Not with bound wrists this time, not with the efficient roughness of people handling cargo. The guards who escorted her were not gentle exactly, but different. They walked slightly further from her than they needed to. They didn't touch her unless she stopped moving. And when she stopped moving, they said her name instead of grabbing her arm. They were afraid of her. That was new. Helen filed it away. She walked the same path she had walked the night before, through the cavern entrance, past the torches, over the smooth stone floor. But it was different in the daylight, what little filtered in through fissures in the rock, and different now that she wasn't bound. Now that she had slept, badly, but some, and processed what had happened and come to a decision she hadn't needed to deliberate about for long. She wasn't going in as an offering. The elder had called her that. The guard who unlocked her door had called her that. The transportation paperwork, she had seen it being carried, described her as an offering, as though nothing had changed. But nothing is unchanged once a Lycan says not yet to it. She walked as something else. She didn't have a word for it yet, but she walked toward it anyway. The inner door opened before anyone touched it. From the inside, she stepped through. She didn't look back. The bond. The light in the inner chamber was better this time, or perhaps she was seeing better. Perhaps the changes in her were already advanced enough that she could find light in places that had been dark before. Either way, she saw him immediately. Not a shadow, not a presence felt before observed. Just him, standing near the far wall, watching the door she had come through. He had been waiting. He had known she was coming. "You came back," he said. Helen stopped a few paces into the room. "I didn't have a choice." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You did." She considered that. It was technically true. The guards would have had to physically carry her to get her back here if she had fought them. She had walked. That was a choice. "And you chose wrong, each Shanari. Sonia," he added. His voice was the same as the night before. Rough, low, carrying those undertones that didn't belong to ordinary sound. But there was something different in it now, something that didn't match the words. Your tone doesn't match what you said, Helen told him. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise. He didn't seem like a creature prone to surprise, but something adjacent to it, an adjustment. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. Helen studied him in the better-than-before light. The scars she had half seen the previous night were clearer now. Not the clean lines of battles, but the chaotic marks of things that had been trying to break him from different directions for a very long time. He wore them the way mountains wear erosion, evidence of forces that had spent themselves on him without quite succeeding. What is not yet? She asked. It means I'm not ready to decide. That's honest. I've had no use for dishonesty. Helen looked at the chamber around them, the ancient stone, the torches, the worn floor. And the council. They want what they've always wanted. A pause. They'll be disappointed. Even if you choose me? Especially then. He moved slowly, still with that quality of deliberate unhurriedness. Not toward her, just movement, like a thing that remembered it could move freely. Because if I choose you, not them, not their plans, not the leash they've been trying to build for 3 years. Helen absorbed this. She thought about her village, her door, splintered, the rope, Mara's name like a prayer, Donna's terrified eyes over her perfectly maintained composure. She thought about how many people's choices had brought her to this room. She thought about what it would mean to make one of her own. The cage days turned into nights. Helen didn't leave the lair again. Not truly. There were moments when she stood at the cavern entrance and watched the outside world from a distance, the hill and the trees and the sky in its various moods. But something kept pulling her back. Not chains, not guards, who had long since stopped positioning themselves between her and exits. Not force of any kind. Something else. Something that had taken root in her chest that night in the inner chamber and hadn't stopped growing since. She learned the lair. It was larger than it appeared from the entrance. Much larger. A network of chambers and passages carved partly by water and partly by intention, on over more time than she could calculate from architectural evidence alone. She found rooms that hadn't been used in decades. Rooms that had been used very recently. A library of sorts, where the texts were old enough that she could only read perhaps a third of them, and the other 2/3 sat at the edges of her literacy like a challenge. She started reading. Justin, she used his name now, at least in her head, watched her do this without comment. He was in the lair most of the time. Present the way a large and ancient thing is present. Undeniable, easy to forget for stretches, and then impossible to ignore. He moved through the chambers with the ease of someone who had lived in a place long enough to own the space in their bones. He answered her questions when she asked them. She asked a lot of questions. He was not the monster of the stories. She had not expected to think that. She had prepared herself, somewhere in the back of her mind, for horror, for something that the human form barely contained, for cruelty that expressed itself in interesting ways, for the kind of damaged intelligence that makes interesting monsters. He was not interesting in that way. He was intelligent in ways that were complicated and sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally brilliant. He had been alive for longer than the stories admitted to. He had seen the pacts before their current politics, before the council system, before any of the frameworks that people use to organize their fear of things like him. He remembered the world before the cage, and he had been living inside it anyway, had been living inside it for long enough that the shape of confinement was written into him the way water writes itself into stone, present in ways he might not even recognize anymore. Helen wasn't chained, but she wasn't free. She thought some nights that neither was he. The awakening. Her power grew. This was the part that nobody had told her about, that the proximity to a Lycan, to the last Lycan, to the original source of pack power before it was diluted through generations and politics and careful interbreeding, was itself a kind of catalyst. It didn't give her new abilities. It didn't rewrite her. What it did was deeper and stranger and in some ways more frightening. It finished her. Like a fire that has been burning low for years, finally given proper air. Her senses completed themselves. The peripheral that had always been slightly out of reach came into focus. The instincts that had sometimes operated at cross purposes with each other, the tiger-lily contradiction, too many bloodlines creating static, settled into coherence. She could hold more thoughts at once. She could feel the air pressure change before weather did. She could hear lies and voices the way other wolves smelled them. She started dreaming in wolf. Not the formless, shifting dream of someone becoming something, but the clear and purposeful dream of something that had always been there, finally with space to be fully itself. The other girls had been returned to their villages. She knew this from a messenger who had come, nervously, on it with a great deal of official preamble, to inform the lair that the ritual council requested a status report. Justin had looked at Helen. Helen had composed the reply. "The ritual is ongoing," she wrote. "No further offerings should be sent." The messenger had looked at the letter, and then at her, and then back at the letter with an expression of someone being asked to carry a grenade. He had carried it anyway. Within a week, the reports began coming back. The packs were arguing. 3 of the major houses had sent envoys to the ritual council demanding explanations. 2 smaller houses had begun moving their borders, not aggressively, but preparatory, like people clearing furniture before a fight. The world was noticing, not just that something was happening at the lair, but what kind of something. Because it wasn't just Justin who had changed, Helen had changed, and mixed-coat tiger lily wolves who change in the proximity of the last Lycan, they are not supposed to become more powerful. They are not supposed to become more themselves. They are certainly not supposed to start dreaming the dreams of an apex predator and wake up feeling like they had made good decisions. The packs became afraid. Good, Helen thought, and surprised herself. The choice. "You can leave," Justin said. It was the middle of the night. Their best conversations happened at the middle of the night, when the guards were furthest from the inner chambers, and the world outside was at its most distant. He was sitting near the old library, which had become a shared space in the way that territories become shared. Gradually, without announcement, by mutual willingness, Helen looked up from the text she'd been translating. "Can I?" He met her eyes. "Physically, the door isn't locked. They'd stop you at the perimeter. My people would. But if you told them you were going, your people," Helen repeated. He paused. "The guards. They stopped calling themselves guards 2 weeks ago. Did you know that? They call themselves the Lair's Company." She set the text down. That happened around the same time the elder from the ritual council sent the second envoy, and the envoy came back without getting a response. Justin was quiet. "Things are changing," Helen said. "Outside, in the packs. Whatever started when I walked through that door. It didn't stay in here." "No," he said. "Things like this don't stay." "So?" She looked at him levelly. "Can I leave?" Silence. A long pause. Honest, undefended. The kind that doesn't try to be something other than what it is. "No," he said. "Truth. Raw. Unfiltered. Not a command. Not a threat. Just a fact that he was clearly not comfortable with and was offering to her anyway because it was the truth, and they had not dealt in anything else." Helen looked at the door, at the stone walls, at the ancient library and its older texts, at the worn floor and the torches and the particular quality of light in a place that had been inhabited long enough to remember the shape of the things that lived there. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. She picked up the text she had been translating. She went back to work. Justin was silent for a long time. When he finally moved to sit across from her, in the space that had been becoming his space in the library for the past 10 days, he did it without explanation, without asking permission, without anything except the simple actuality of choosing where to be. 2 things that did not run. Staying. The Devil's Queen. Not the end, the beginning. The world outside whispered her name. Not the way they had whispered it before, with the particular dismissiveness reserved for tiger lily wolves, for mixed coats, for the wolves who existed between categories and therefore counted as none of them. Not with pity, not with the careful avoidance of direct engagement that is the social equivalent of pretending something inconvenient isn't there. With fear, Helen stood at the edge of the lair, the cavern entrance, where the carved stone gave way to open hill, and watched the torches of the envoy train disappearing down the path that led to the western road. Third envoy in 2 weeks. This one had come from the conclave itself, the seven-pack governing body whose decisions shaped the political life of every wolf within the territory. They had come for an answer. She had given them one. Not the answer they wanted. She knew that from the stiffness of the lead envoy's spine as he walked away, from the quality of the silence he had maintained throughout their conversation. They had wanted the old story, the one where the last Lycan was a resource to be exploited, and the girl from the ritual was collateral in the process. She had offered them a different story. They would need time to decide whether to accept it. The moon above her was 3/4 full, when 4 nights until the next peak. She felt it in her blood, not the desperate, destabilizing pull that unmated wolves described, not the anxiety of approaching something powerful without a foundation to stand on, but a deep tidal pull toward completion, toward the thing that had been building since the inner chamber, since the 2 fingers against her jaw, since not yet became something both of them were navigating carefully toward. The darkness behind her breathed. She felt him before she heard him. The warmth, the presence, the gravitational reality of something that took up more space in a room than its physical dimensions accounted for. "They'll come back," Justin said. "Yes, with more than envoys." "Probably." Helen didn't turn. She watched the last torches disappear around the bend. Just the conclave has never lost a resource they decided to claim. They'll call it reclamation. They'll call it restoration of order. They'll have very good reasons and very clean language, and the reasons and the language will cover war, he said. The word hung in the night air between them. Helen finally turned. In the 3 weeks she had been in the lair, she had watched him change, slowly, in ways that were subtle and then suddenly weren't. The way gradual things tend to become obvious. The rigidity that she had initially read as coldness had revealed itself as something else. The protective immobility of something that has been alone long enough to forget it doesn't have to be. She had watched him remember piece by piece what it meant to exist in relation to another living thing, to matter to something, to have something matter. Because she had watched him wake up, and now he was looking at her with eyes that were completely, unflinchingly present. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He waited. He was very good at waiting now. Or perhaps he had always been good at it, had practiced it for years alone, and she was only now seeing it deployed towards something he wanted to hear. "My bloodline," she said. "The tiger lily. The scholars call it a mixed coat. 2 bloodlines that don't cleanly align. What they don't say, what the texts in your library do say, is what happens when a tiger lily undergoes a full awakening in proximity to an apex source." She watched him process this. "The mixed coat resolves," he said slowly. "The mixed coat resolves," she confirmed. "The 2 bloodlines don't neutralize each other. They," she paused, found the right word, "winwan or synthesize. I don't become one or the other. I become both, simultaneously, which means I can do things that neither bloodline can do independently, which means the conclave is about to discover that the offering they sent to be used as a leash has become something they have no framework for." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you're telling me this because if we do this, we do it honestly. Both of us. No strategies that the other doesn't know about. No plans that the other hasn't agreed to." She held his gaze. "We do this as—" She stopped, because there was a word for what they were. She had been not saying it for 3 weeks. He said it first. "Partners." Helen held very still. "Partners," she said. "Yes." Outside, right in the territory that the conclave claimed and the lair sat at the center of, the political machinery of 7 packs was grinding toward a decision. Reports were being written, alliances were being tested. Warriors who had spent years carefully not thinking about the last Lycan were being asked to think about him seriously. Were being asked to think about what it meant that the ritual had not failed. Were being asked to consider what it meant that the offering had not come back. Were being told quietly by the lead envoy, "She is not what she was. She is not what we expected. She is not someone we know how to account for." The moon moved. The night deepened. Helen looked out at the dark territory around the lair. The hill, the trees, and the road down which envoys came and left with their careful diplomatic words, and felt the weight of it without being crushed by it. She was not free. She understood that. Someone had once told her, her mother perhaps, or someone who had known her mother, that freedom was the absence of walls, that you measured it in the things you could leave, in the open road and the untied hands and the door that swung wide when you pushed it. Helen had believed that once. She believed something different now. Freedom wasn't the absence of walls. Freedom was knowing which walls were yours, was choosing the room you stayed in, not because the door was locked, but because the room was worth being in, because what was in it was worth being with, because the lair, which had been a prison for 20 years, and had become something else in the weeks since a tiger lily wolf had walked through its inner door and refused to be what everyone assumed she was. She had not been tamed. She had not tamed him. They had both become something new. "They'll come with armies," Justin said. He had moved to stand beside her, and their silence was the comfortable kind now, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. 3 packs probably. The conclave votes on military action in cycles of 7, and they're missing a vote from House Alderaan since Alderaan's Alpha sent us a private message last week saying he was interested in an alternative arrangement, Helen said. He looked at her. "I've been busy," she said. The expression on his face was something she had been collecting, privately, over the course of the past 3 weeks. It was the expression of someone encountering a thing they thought they understood and discovering new dimensions. It was the expression of someone who had been surprised and found the surprise worthwhile. She had not seen it on his face before she arrived. She suspected no one had. "You've been negotiating with a pack alpha," he said. "I've been having a conversation. The negotiation happens when he comes here in person, which he will because he's afraid of what the conclave will do to his pack if he doesn't find a strong secondary alliance in the next moon cycle." She paused. "He has 2 daughters and a younger brother with a tiger lily granddaughter. He understands what it means to be underestimated." Justin was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to rebuild the whole structure," he said finally. Not an accusation. Not quite wonder. Something in between. "Not alone." She looked at him. "That's what partners means." The moon rose higher. Behind them, the lair. Old stone, worn floor, ancient library, torches that burned without guttering, breathed steadily in the dark. The guards, who called themselves the lair's company, moved through their rotations with the quiet competence of people who had chosen their allegiance rather than being assigned to it. Somewhere in the distance, House Alderaan's envoy was riding hard. Somewhere further, the conclave was voting. Somewhere further still, 3 packs were looking at their warriors and beginning to count. None of them knew what they were counting against. The Devil's Lair did not feel like a prison. It had not felt like a prison for a long time. It felt like what it was, a stronghold, a foundation. The beginning of something that the old order had been trying to prevent for years, and failing, because you cannot prevent a true thing forever. You can only delay it long enough to pretend it isn't coming. Helen looked up at the moon and felt it. The tide, the pull, the 4 nights away promise of completion and change, and something she had been walking towards since before she knew she was walking. Something the tiger lily in her blood had been waiting for through generations, through every careful dilution and cautious interbreeding, surviving in the margins of heredity until it landed, finally, in her. Ready? She had been told once that she was an accident, standing here, at the threshold of an ancient stronghold, beside the last Lycan, 4 days from the full moon that would change everything. She thought, yes, perhaps, might the best things usually are. Justin's hand found hers in the dark. Not a claim, not a command. Just there, just choosing to be there. She did not pull away. And coming in. Part 2. The Conclave declares war. 3 packs unite under a single banner for the first time in living memory. All of it aimed at the lair and the 2 things inside it that refuse to be accounted for. House Alderaan arrives with politics, secrets, and a tiger lily granddaughter who recognizes Helen as something she has no name for yet. The truth about the tiger lily bloodline, what it was bred from, what it was bred for, and why the oldest records in Justin's library have a name for it that predates the packs themselves. The full moon, the bond completed, and what comes out on the other side. And the question that the Conclave, in all its planning, forgot to ask. What does the devil do when he has something worth fighting for? The story continues.